Welcome back, everyone. This is Congressman Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, and you're listening to Honest Talks with Honest Abe, the show that fills you in on all the political news you need to know. Today, we're with Frederick Douglass.
Hello, everyone.
A former slave and eloquent speaker who's here to talk about his autobiography, Narratives of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which describes the terrors of slavery. Let's get into it. You said you don't remember much of your early life, and have little to no knowledge of the years. What can you tell me about your childhood? Your family?
Like you said, I have no way to confirm the day or year of my birth, as those records were never officially created. As a child, this was a source of much sadness for me. It was hard because all of the white children knew their ages, and I saw no reason as to why I could not. As for my childhood, I was born in Talbot County, Maryland, and of course, I was separated from my mother as an infant.
That must have been very hard for you. I know my mother was such a pinnacle part of my life.
Yeah, I only ever saw her 4 or 5 times before her death, which was of little impact to me, as you can imagine, because I barely knew her. I also had a brother whom I had virtually no relationship with, and an Aunt Hester who was the frequent subject of brutal punishment from the master of the house. Like most enslaved peoples, my childhood was so short-lived, it basically didn't exist.
Within your narrative, you describe the immense differences between the plantation where you were born and the city of Baltimore, where you worked later in your life. Could you summarize some of those differences for our audience?
Yeah, sure. Out on the plantation, you worked from dawn to dusk in the fields every day. The masters out there are harsh as expected. In the fields, there is no one to judge the quality of living or how terrible the punishments are. In Baltimore, I experienced a whole new story. I'll never forget the shock I felt when I first saw my new master and his wife, Hugh and Sophia Auld. Her face was filled with such a kindness that I had never known before. I was better clothed, fed more, and overall much happier in Baltimore than I had been on the plantation.
That's quite the drastic difference. Still, you described the swift change that took the heart of Sophia Auld. What happened to encourage such a change?
Well, Mrs. Auld was very intent on teaching me how to read, which was illegal for a slave at the time, and for a short time I was finally granted the fruits of knowledge that I so desperately desired. However, Mr. Auld found out and quickly put a stop to it. He claimed that learning to read would only bring me more pain and that my ignorance was bliss.
How could he be so single-minded as to promote such a fallacy?
From then on, Mrs. Auld's heart was soured. She was even crueler in some ways than her husband had originally been. Unfortunately, I believe she felt the need to overcompensate for the kindness she had originally shown me.
I assume you wish to continue your education. How did you go about that?
While on my errands, I would approach the boys at the docks and challenge them by claiming I could write my name better than they could theirs. Another ploy I engaged in was bribing them with spare bread in exchange for reading lessons. I owe part of my current education to those boys, as they were the first step toward a world of knowledge.
You've often claimed that the harsh experiences you were subjected to in Maryland were nothing compared to the treatment of slaves currently in the Deep South. However, when your original master died, you were sent from Baltimore to a farm where you experienced challenges like you had never faced.
That is correct. When my first master, Captain Anthony, died, I was sent back to the plantation to be assessed for my worth, another form of dehumanization that slaves often face. After a series of more deaths in the family, I was sent to Thomas Auld, who believed that living in the city had ruined me.
Ruined you?
Yes, he believed that I needed to be retaught how to work on the farm. He sent me to Mr. Covey, a man who was paid to retrain slaves, and I lived there for a year. Like you mentioned, those months were some of the hardest of my life. My resolve to escape to freedom was inexplicably broken, and I began to believe I would die there.
Did your stay at the farm ever improve while you were there?
Actually, there was a day when, above anything, I had resolved to return to my master, Thomas Auld, and beg him to let me come home from Mr. Covey's service. After traveling for a few miles, I finally reached Thomas Auld, but to my dismay, he merely reprimanded me for leaving and bid me to return to Mr. Covey at once. Mr. Covey, naturally, was furious at my leaving and began to race after me with the cowskin. I found sanctuary in the forest where I ran into a slave named Sandy Jenkins, who was on his way to visit his free wife. After telling Sandy my predicament, he gifted me the most peculiar thing, a small root. He told me that as long as I kept the root in my pocket, I would be unharmed. When I returned to Mr. Covey's farm, he made an attempt to bind me up, but at that moment, and from what spirit I do not know, I resolved to fight back. After tussling for quite a while, Mr. Covey had let me be, and for the rest of the time I was in his service, I did not face a beating ever again.
How remarkable. And now, we're going to welcome another special guest, Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, a known civil reformer and author of the newspaper The Liberator. Mr. Garrison, you wrote the preface for Mr. Douglass's narrative. Within the preface, you describe hearing Douglass speak for the first time at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. What effect did his speech have on you?
Thank you, Mr. Lincoln. I'm already regarded by the public as a hardy abolitionist, but I don't think I hated slavery with as much fury as I did hearing him speak at Nantucket. The audience was in celebratory uproar from him from the beginning to the end of his speech. The sheer humility I witnessed from Douglass rivals no other. Hearing the raw, unfiltered truth of slavery from a former slave himself was more inspiring than the bold words of liberty of Patrick Henry.
How were you able to convince Douglass to join the abolitionist movement by giving more speeches?
Well, it wasn't an effort I made alone. I had great support from Mr. John A. Collins from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. While Douglass was initially apprehensive to the idea of giving speeches, thinking he would do more harm than good, after much convincing, he agreed.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison, for your time. Now, a quick word from our sponsors.
Is your hair undeniably dull? Need a quick way to spruce it up? Run on down to Sinclair's and get a new can of hair grease. It's shiny, soft, and smooth. Not to mention it smells like flowers straight from your mom's garden on a Sunday afternoon. Stop by and get your hair grease, now for just 25 cents per can.
Welcome back to Honest Talks with Honest Abe. We're here with Frederick Douglass as he talks about the conclusion of his time with Mr. Covey. Mr. Douglass, you returned to your master on Christmas Day in 1833. Was it a relief to know you'd be returning during the holidays?
While it might seem that way at first, it was almost quite the opposite. The time between Christmas and New Year's are allotted as holidays where slaves are not required to do more work than care for the stock. But these breaks are simply another ploy in a master's attempt to control his slave. You see, these holidays aren't meant to give slaves a break, but rather, in most cases, a false narrative of freedom that the slave will never enjoy. A common tactic in practicing this trickery is the use of liquor. The overwhelming drunkenness that the master allows his slave to feel is to show that if one weren't in misery of being a slave to man, he would be in misery of being a slave to the bottle. By the time that the holidays are over, we'd be just as happy to return to our work as we were to leave it.
After leaving Edward Covey's service, you went to live with William Freeland. How did the two differ from each other?
Well, you see, my service with Mr. Freeland seemed heavenly compared to my time with Mr. Covey, as you can imagine. Although the former had many faults peculiar to being a slaveholder, he was indubitably free from a number of degrading vices that plagued the latter. Mr. Covey was a tricky and deceitful man who'd use his cunning nature to punish slaves for little to no reason at all. Mr. Freeland was open and frank and could always be found easily. Perhaps the greatest advantage to being in Mr. Freeland's service, however, was his indifference to imposing religion on his slaves.
What effect does religion have on the treatment of a slave?
While I profess that it is not as great as a calamity in Maryland as in other parts of the South, there is undoubtedly a thick coat of malice entrapping the minds of religious slaveholders. It is a sad truth that the religion of the South is a wicked justifier for the crimes committed in the context of slavery. It provides protection for the cruelest and meanest slaveholders who are desperately in want of a justification for their ugly ways.
Frankly, if I may add, it is an abomination for these slaveholders to skew such a faith and preach a false gospel. It was also within Mr. Freeland's service that you re-sparked your burning desire for freedom in yourself as well as others. How did your time with Mr. Freeland lead up to your first attempted escape?
Well, this is how it went. There were 4 other slaves besides myself who worked for Mr. Freeland. It was Henry and John Harris, Sandy Jenkins, and Handy Caldwell. Seeing as all of them were rather intelligent beings, it did not take long for me to instill a want of learning to read in them. So, for the next few weeks, every Sunday, I dedicated myself to teaching my brethren their letters and how to spell. From there, I continued to, in small amounts, imbue them with the hopes of emancipation. At the start of 1835, I resolved that the year should not pass without me having attempted to escape slavery. For a time, my plan seemed fruitful and freedom was in reach. However, it was not to last. My first plan included myself, Henry Harris, John Harris, Henry Bailey, and Charles Roberts, the two latter being relatives of mine. I had forged each of us protections, which would serve to protect us as we traveled north across Chesapeake Bay. But the morning of the day of our planned departure, I had a terrible feeling arise in myself that we had been betrayed. To my dismay, I had been arrested along with my fellow cohorts and taken to Easton jail.
Do you have any idea who might have betrayed you?
That I do not. I do know that whoever turned us in rightfully deemed me the one in charge of the escape, considering the words of Miss Betsy Freeland, mother of William Freeland. After dividing biscuits between the Harris brothers, she rather severely reprimanded me, saying that Henry and John never would have ran away on their own accord.
What happened following your arrest?
Not even 20 minutes after our arrival to Easton Jail were we swarmed by slave traders, hoping to ascertain our value. Over the holidays, Mr. Freeland came and took my 3 fellow escapees, leaving me alone to my utmost dismay. The most shocking thing, however, was after a week of being kept in jail, my master, Thomas Auld, came to take me home. He sent me back to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld.
That's quite a homecoming. You hadn't seen Hugh or Sophia Auld since you were merely a child. How did they react to seeing you again?
Mr. Auld, for one, was simply outraged that I had been harmed in such a way. He and Sophia Auld nursed me back to health and got me a job with a shipbuilder named William Gardner.
How was your job at the shipyard?
To be honest, quite terrible. At the time I worked there, the shipyard was busy trying to meet a deadline, so all the work was very overwhelming. I couldn't find a way to learn any of the skills I needed to learn. To make matters worse, one day, relatively 8 months into my apprenticeship there, I was attacked by a group of white men who were disgruntled by working with me for so long. They were worried that slaves would take their jobs.
How terrible. How did the Aulds react?
Mr. Auld ventured to get me a lawyer so that I may be represented in court. But I had no one to testify on my behalf. This was because no black man was allowed to testify, and no white man would testify against my attackers. Still, once I was back to my full strength, the Aulds got me an apprenticeship with a different shipyard worker, where I started to earn wages.
Were you allowed to keep these wages?
Not at first. Initially, I required to forfeit all my money to Mr. Hugh. On the occasion, he would let me keep a tiny fraction of the money I make, which only angered me even more. If I was allowed to keep a small amount of the money I make, I should be able to keep all of it. Eventually, Mr. Hugh let me do freelance work where I would make more money, but I paid weekly dues to Mr. Hugh.
Your condition seems to have improved majorly over the course of your narrative. What finally pushed you to escape?
It was once again about the wages I made. 1 month, I neglected to pay Mr. Hugh my dues, which made him believe that I was planning to escape. Because of this, he retracted my ability to do freelance work. This led to a major spat, eventually convincing me to leave.
How did you finally manage to get your freedom?
Of course, I can't share my full story at risk of revealing some kind of souls who aided my escape, but I digress. I worked extra diligently during that time to ward off Mr. Hugh's suspicions, and on the 3rd of September, I finally made my escape. I left for New York with much sadness, having left my friends in Baltimore, but excited for the future.
Your narrative has inspired thousands of people over the years. Do you have anything to say to those people now?
Yes, indeed I do. Slavery is the single greatest terror to ever befall civilized society, but overcoming it is possible. To all the listeners, educate yourselves. Pay attention to the politics of our nation. It is only all together that we can truly become a land of the free.
What inspiring words from Mr. Frederick Douglass. Be sure to keep them in mind for the upcoming elections. This is the conclusion of Honest Talks with Honest Abe, but make sure to tune in next week to hear words of wisdom from another leading politician. Thank you. Have a great day, listeners.